pulling apart or stretching apart of food within the small intestine. It's kind of like a peristalsis used to mix the chyme that's coming from the stomach and bring it in closer contact with that mucosa for greater absorption of nutrients. And it's governed by these things called myotic plexuses, essentially nervous system control. In the small intestine, you also have these circular folds called plicae circularis within the mucosa, submucosa, that encourage the turbulent flow of chyme. Something that's also in the small intestine that encourages, I'm doing this for a purpose, increases surface area are called villi, tiny finger-like projections. They can barely be seen with the naked eye. And they're covered with columnar epithelium, and we'll look close here. On the top of them are even smaller structures called microvilli. And all of these things, including the plicae circularis, the villi, and microvilli, help increase the surface area, or essentially the room to for the chyme that's coming through the small intestine to come in contact with the small intestine to increase the amount of nutrients that are absorbed, or the rate the nutrients can be absorbed. Within the villi itself, so we see the out part of it, there's also deep crevices. These are what are secreting intestinal juices. Trypsin exists in pancreatic juice already, an active form, and it needs one of these intestinal glands to release trypsinogen that activates the trypsin. There's also within the villi here, there's goblet cells. Those secrete mucus, if I didn't say that before. Most of the enzyme digestion in the small intestine occurs within those epithelial cells or on their surfaces, rather than in the middle of the lumen. So for that to happen, it has to come into contact with the brush border, essentially this part, or down in that area of the villi. Somebody that has celiac disease, where their body can't properly digest wheat protein, essentially these areas are clogged up, so proper amount of nutrients can't go down into these areas, this brush border, for the nutrients to be absorbed, so their body suffers from not getting the proper nutrients. Plus there's some other GI tract issues like indigestion, diarrhea, or the opposite, constipation. So what is absorption itself? The majority happens in the small intestine, and it's the nutrients going from the GI tract to the blood outside of it, so, or the lymph around it. 90% of it happens in the small intestine. What's absorbed into the blood? The amino acids of proteins, nucleic acids, the simple sugars, monosaccharides. And how they're moved is either by facilitated diffusion or active transport, depending on what it is. Triglycerides, fats, specialized aggregate into globules, and one of your videos talk about that, along with phospholipids and cholesterol, and they become coated with proteins. When that happens, they're called chylomicrons. And they're too large to enter the blood capillaries. And what they actually have to do is enter specialized lymphatic vessels within the villi called lacteals. Eventually then, they will come back to the blood via the superior vena cava. And all then dietary lipids are absorbed by simple diffusion. The large intestine, of course, attached to the small intestine, is about 5 feet in length. So why is it called large then? Because the diameter is larger than the small intestine. It's shorter in length, but it's thicker in diameter. It has 4 parts, the cecum right here, ascending, transverse, descending, sigmoid, I should say. The cecum is the first part, and then the colon itself, which includes the ascending, transverse, descending, sigmoid, this rounded version, of course, then the rectum, then the anal canal. We don't have any villi, circular folds in the intestine. It's mostly mucosive. What it absorbs is mainly water. You also have a lot of goblet cells that secrete the mucus, but none whatsoever digestive enzymes. So no digestion happens in the small intestine, and mainly just the absorption of water. It's attached to the posterior wall by something called a mesocolon, peritoneal membrane. The smooth muscle that runs the length of the colon becomes essentially separated into small pouches called haustra, making there's a little segmented appearance to the large intestine, the colon. So essentially, as one haustrum distends or gets thicker or stretches, it stimulates the muscles in that area to push it to the next little haustra. Then it distends, gets thicker or stretches it, then it pushes to the next one, etc., etc. The cecum is where, if you go back here, the cecum is the area where the small intestine meets the large intestine. That's the cecum. And attached in the cecum that's where we find the appendix. So this is their right lower quadrant. And then we go into the colon itself, the ascending, the descending, transverse. The ascending and descending colon are retroperitoneal, so they're in the back, and the transverse and sigmoid are in the front. Kind of interesting. And then it goes into the rectum, 8 inches long, into the anal canal, and that's just the last inch of it. The mucous membranes are arranged in folds. Anal columns has a lot of arteries and veins in the area. And the exterior, of course, is called the anus. There it is again. Ascending, transverse, descending, sigmoid. So get this. We drink about 2 liters, and then about 7 extra liters of fluid enter the small intestine each day, and the small intestine absorbs 8 of those 9 liters. The remainder, about 1 liter, passes into the large intestine, and most of it's absorbed. So really, in our feces, we only excrete 100 milliliters of water a day. So just think about the diarrhea for a moment. Okay, diarrhea is feces that has more water than it should, right? So diarrhea results from essentially food moving through your small intestine, your large intestine too quickly. So not enough of the water is absorbed into the blood. So that's why it produces watery stools, because your intestines are irritated for some reason, whether you have a stomach bug or you have giardia or you have the plague or something, dysentery, that's going to irritate it, causing it to move out quickly. Feces, what it is, it's material that couldn't be digested for whatever reason, leftovers. It actually still, though, contains a large amount of energy. 50% of that of the original food, which is interesting. The brown color comes from the bile pigments, bile, and then bilirubin, that's from the blood, like the broken down blood vessels. Not blood vessels, blood cells. And the odor is due to bacterial action in your colon, aerobic and anaerobic bacteria. We also have microorganisms in the intestines. 10 times as many, a lot in your intestines. With most of the microorganisms being bacteria. And bacteria may make up most of the flora in the colon. They actually secrete beneficial chemicals as they work. Vitamin K, biotin, vitamin B, and some amino acids. And actually some of our main sources of this nutrient. So they're doing good as they make stinky feces. Reflexes control the mechanical events associated with defecation, or the movement of the undigested material out of the body. It includes the haustral churning, like the movement from haustra to haustra in the large intestine, and peristalsis. So the strong bouts of mass peristalsis that happen are two autonomic nervous system responses called the gastroileal reflex and the gastrocolic reflex. And both occur with distension of the stomach. So as the stomach stretches. The first one, gastroileal, causes relaxation of that ileocecal valve. Essentially where the small intestine meets the large intestine. So it intensifies the peristalsis, or the movement from the ileum into the cecum. that region where it joins the large intestine. The gastrocolic reflex intensifies strong peristaltic waves that begin about the middle of the transverse colon and quickly drive it into the contents into the colon, the rest of it descending, and then into the rectum. So you're like, must have to go soon. And then the mass peristalsis, are essentially the exiting of your rectum, takes place 3 or 4 times a day during or immediately after a meal. And the actual getting the feces out is the defecation reflex, activated by stretch receptors in the anal canal. And what stimulates those is just the filling of the rectum from that previous reflex. So what leads to that? Food in the stomach. And as it moves through the stomach into the intestine, from the intestine into the rectum. You have actually receptors in the rectum that respond to distension of the rectum, and then those muscles in the area will shorten. The autonomic nervous system releases the internal anal sphincter and gives a conscious awareness, like you got